Howdy, Scientific Science, looking at autotrophs, heterotrophs, and energy. Thanks to Sam Moyle for producing this PowerPoint. So science understandings we're going to look at. Cells require inputs of suitable forms of energy, including light or chemical energy. You need to be able to distinguish between autotrophs and heterotrophs. The sun is the main source of energy for life. Recognize photosynthesis is important. Here's the equation for photosynthesis. You need to be able to write that. Recognize that energy is required to break chemical bonds, and energy is released when new bonds are formed. Describe the formation of ATP from ADP and P, and describe the conversion of ATP to ADP and P, which releases energy. Cells require energy. Energy is the capacity to do work in physics, so things like moving, so in us, contracting muscles, active transport, so moving substances against a concentration gradient, exocytosis, endocytosis, phagocytosis, which we're going to go through in a little bit, making large macromolecules, all of these things require energy. And this enables the cell to grow, repair, reproduce, and function. In order for the energy to be used properly, cells need to have that stable internal environment that we've talked about. So solute balance, pH, temperature, oxygen, waste, concentration, all these need to be kept within the optimum range. And there's a video here that I'll link to on DayMap. So where does the energy come from? It has to be obtained from the environment, either physical or chemical form. So in terms of physical form, we're talking about sunlight. In terms of chemical energy, we're talking about energy-rich compounds. In both cases, the energy is transformed from chemical potential energy into other types of energy, or even stored back into chemical potential energy. Plant cells and some other photosynthetic organisms have chloroplasts that transform light energy into chemical energy. And animals have muscles that convert chemical energy into movement. So there's some examples of that transformation of energy from one type into another. So you need to be able to distinguish between autotrophs and heterotrophs. So an autotroph is self-feeding. So auto means self, trophy is getting food from, nourishing. Most autotrophs use sunlight as a physical energy source. So they're storing chemical energy from light energy, and we call that photosynthesis, that process. Heterotrophs need to get energy from another source. So hetero means another, trophy, again, feeding, nourishing. They're getting chemical energy from the environment and using that as their energy source. So we are heterotrophs because we need to eat food. We eat food, we get organic compounds, and then we break those down and release energy. Whereas autotrophs will use light energy as a physical source of energy to make organic compounds, which they then break down to release energy that they can use. So let's talk about photosynthesis. So we're turning light energy into chemical potential energy, and this happens in plant cells in chloroplasts. Chlorophyll is a green pigment. It absorbs light in the granum, so inside the chloroplast. We've talked about this before. So a granum is a stack of thylakoids. A thylakoid is one of these round discs that contains the chlorophyll. Inside the granum and stroma, which is the fluid around it, there are enzymes that catalyze reactions that lead to this overall reaction. It's a complicated chemical process, but this is the simplified version of what's happening. So carbon dioxide and water, catalyzed by chlorophyll and using light, produces glucose and oxygen. So this is the chemical equation that you need to know. So carbon dioxide plus water goes to glucose plus oxygen, and the requirements are chlorophyll and light for that to happen. So we put those above and below the arrow. The glucose produced from photosynthesis, so the C6H12O6, it's got a lot of bonds in it, and you can break those bonds and then reform new bonds, and when you do that you release energy. So glucose is a pretty big molecule. You turn it into smaller molecules, and when you do that you make a lot of bonds, and making those bonds releases energy that the organism can then use. So this is what we would call an exothermic reaction, because it's releasing energy because the amount of energy required to break the chemical bonds in the reactants, so that's the glucose and the oxygen, is less than the energy released when the bonds reform between the carbon dioxide and water. So we get more energy being released than is used to do the initial breakup. So that's why it's an exothermic process. And some of that energy can be used by the cell to do work, and the rest is lost as heat. In terms of doing work, that's doing those processes that we talked before. Reproduction, growth, repair, all those kinds of things, movement, they require energy. And the cell can use the energy from this breakdown process to do that work. One of the most important energy storage compounds in the cell is called ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate. So ATP, it's got adenine, which we talked about when we talked about RNA. It's bonded with a ribose sugar, so that makes it the adenosine. And then there's 3 phosphate groups that are joined to it. The third bond is pretty unstable and can be hydrolyzed, and what that means is it can be broken down with water. Water comes in and hydrolyzes the bond, and when that happens we form adenosine diphosphate, or ADP, and a little phosphate group. We represent that with capital P and a subscript I. We're making new bonds when we break the ATP and turn it into ADP and P, and those new bonds release energy when they're formed, and there's an excess of energy produced, and that energy can be used to run processes in the cell. Cells are using ATP all the time, but they're also producing it all the time, so it's a very important molecule. It's our energy currency inside our cells. The energy required to produce the ATP from ADP and P comes from the breakdown of big molecules like glucose, and the energy released when the bonds reform in the products. And we call that process cellular respiration. So this is the ATP-ADP cycle. So here's our ATP. So we've got our adenosine, sugar, nitrogenous base here, and then we've got our 3 phosphate groups. If we're going to use ATP to produce some energy for the cells to use, the third bond here is hydrolyzed. So water comes in and hydrolyzes that bond, and we get some new bonds forming, and when those new bonds form, that releases energy that the cell can use. Then we've got ADP, so we've got a diphosphate here, so di means 2, tri means 3. So we've got ADP plus a phosphate group here, and then if we put energy into this process, then again we're going to break some bonds and reform some bonds, but this time when the bonds reform, that requires more energy than what was present initially. So energy is used in this process to make ATP again from ADP and a phosphate group. So it's a cycle, and it's a continual cycle, and this just keeps on going and going and going. This is moderated by enzymes in your body, and they're very, very important enzymes. The key thing is that energy from breaking down big compounds like glucose is used to drive this process, to turn the ADP and phosphate group into ATP. And then whenever your cell requires energy, it can use an ATP molecule to provide that energy to do something like move a muscle or make a cell divide. Whenever that cell requires energy, it will be turning those ATPs into ADPs and Ps. So this is a very important cycle to remember. So let's go through our checks. So cells require inputs of suitable forms of energy, including light energy or chemical energy. And so in autotrophs, they're often using light energy. Heterotrophs are using chemical energy as their inputs. Sun is the main source of energy for life because that drives photosynthesis. Talk about photosynthesis as the conversion of light energy into chemical potential energy, and you need to know that equation. And recognize that energy is required to break chemical bonds, and energy is released when new bonds are formed. Talk about the ATP-ADP cycle in a bit of detail. So today on Flipping Science, we looked at autotrophs, heterotrophs, and energy. That's it for Flipping Science today. See ya!